Hello and welcome to the CNSS Podcast. My name is Tamam Moksha and I am a non resident visiting senior scholar at the Center for National Security Studies at the MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences. My guest for today is Rami Desai, an author, anthropologist, and researcher with over 2 decades of fieldwork experience studying insurgency, ethnic armed organizations, religion, and identity issues. She's a distinguished fellow at the India Foundation, where she focuses on northeast of India and India's relations with its neighbors, including Myanmar. She also leads several key initiatives on regional security and policy. Her work is widely published in national journals and magazines. She also writes a column for First Post titled Ramification. She's a frequent panelist on English and Hindi news channels, and her insights are particularly important because she brings rare, field based perspectives from her recent travels across Myanmar. Hi, Ms. Desai. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today. From what I understand, you were in Myanmar during the elections, which must have been an incredibly intense time to witness the country up close. Could you maybe paint a picture for our listeners as to what it felt like on the ground? What was the mood among ordinary people there?
Hi, so thank you for having me on your show. I think this is a really important conversation because Myanmar is not spoken about so much, yet it lies in our immediate neighborhood. Therefore, whatever happens in Myanmar has direct implications on India. The elections in Myanmar were very awaited, not just by India, but across the world. They've been long awaited. They've been very watched because post the coup in 2021, there was pressure mounting on the Tatmadaw to bring back the democratic processes of the country, which had been lost after the. I had the opportunity to observe the elections in the third phase as an independent international observer. And in the third phase, I was on ground. I saw 6 constituencies. I had the opportunity to visit 6 constituencies and see the election process, understand the detailed processes of the elections in terms of what the checks and balances were, as well as speak to some of the voters on ground, as well as understand the new mechanism, which is the EVM. So this is the first time that Myanmar has used the electronic voting machine. Before this, the last elections, just before the coup, they were still using paper ballot. So, and there have been many changes in these elections. I think to answer your question as to what was the feeling on ground, in the third phase, in all the constituencies, there was a regular inflow of voters. There were about 64 parties that took part, 6 at a national level and then the rest at a regional level. There was about 56.5% voter turnout in the final phase, which was unexpected because I think by most accounts it was supposed to be, a lot of people speculated that it would be much lower. But 56.5% was not bad. It is also interesting to note that the EVMs had very strict processes that were attached to it. So in terms of how would a voter cast their vote, how many lists would it be checked against, it was very similar to India's, but it's indigenously made. So all in all, I would say that the process was robust, but with the absence of NLD, there was certain criticism as well, wherein critics have called it a non-inclusive election because NLD did not take part in it. But apart from that, their processes were robust.
Right. And now that the election results are out, I would like to look at this from India's point of view. So, how should we understand these results from, say, a strategic perspective? And do they really change Myanmar's political direction in any meaningful way?
Look, elections have happened, which is a good start, a step towards democracy. NLD is not a part of it. India hopes for an inclusive election at some point. But I'm not, let me be clear, I'm not a government person, official, spokesperson. So all of this is just my own speculation that India, being in its neighborhood, finally want more inclusive elections. But I think the elections, while it's a good step towards full democratic transitions, and the elections will also bring international legitimacy to Myanmar. By saying that, I mean that with more international legitimacy, sanctions may be lifted, or difficult relationships that other countries have with Myanmar will ease out and increase trade and some amount of engagement, which will only be helpful to the people of Myanmar who have suffered throughout these years in terms of its, with the conflict and with limited engagement with the outside world. They obviously have suffered on ground. So it will help the people of Myanmar. But in India's case, I think what doesn't change even after the elections is the conflict. The conflict will ensue. Elections is not a resolution. Out of maybe about 67 of the constituencies that couldn't go into elections, over 60% are across India's borders. That means that the areas that are most conflict ridden, at least 60% or more of those are across India's borders. So that tells us that the concentration of the conflict is just across our borders, and we have 1,643 kilometers of porous borders. So it will have implications on India. One, that is the conflict, which means that the conflict could also spill over to India. There could also be migration from Myanmar to India, because whenever there's conflict, we see an inflow of poor people that come in who are impacted by the conflict. It could also impact IIGs, the Indian insurgent groups that function out of these areas. It could make them more robust. Number two, I think the problem lays in the fact that, there's also a big narcotics trade that has now evolved in Myanmar. They always had some to a certain level, but it was never as big as it is today, largely because of the ban of poppy cultivation in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. The industry was largely shifted to Myanmar, because not only was Myanmar had conducive conditions, so not only was Myanmar in a state of conflict, but it had certain ready-made supply chains in terms of the trade routes. It always had a certain amount of methamphetamine production that happened there. It had poppy cultivation that used to happen there. Obviously, never at this scale. After the crackdown in Afghanistan, the scale has become one of the biggest in the world. United Nations, UNODC calls it the epicenter of methamphetamine production in the world. So Myanmar has become the epicenter of narcotics production. A lot of the landing of that is in India, especially in India's northeast, from where it then is further sort of, it gets distributed. Some of the areas are like Champai district in Mizoram, Tamu More crossing from Myanmar into Manipur. So, there are many of these points where a lot of narcotics is coming in. Not only that, does that have an impact in terms of security, but also developmental and health issues in these areas. The other, obviously, the final third factor I think I see being problematic for India is the fact that we know the association, the relationship between narcotics and weapons. So the proliferation of weapons in the conflict areas in Myanmar, if narcotics trade is going, that means that they have the money to buy better weapons as well. Already we know a lot of the groups have very sophisticated weaponry. They have drones, they have anti-drone systems. This will only keep getting enhanced, and that will have its natural repercussions on India and the Indian borders and Indian IIGs as well. Finally, there is the cyber scam units in Myanmar, which are in the Mayawadi area of Myanmar on the border of Thailand. A lot of the cyber scams are aimed towards India. A lot of the people who are a part of these cyber scams are Indians, because young Indians are being fooled sometimes into joining these by making them feel that these are legitimate jobs. So they land up in Mayawadi, they join these cyber scams, and they realize that they are stuck there and they are unable to get out. That is obviously one part of the story, but the other part of the story is the financial losses that India incurs through cyber scams. Last year itself, it was estimated that it's 22,500 crores in the last fiscal year. That is only slated to increase, but also that while some of the inmates in these cyber scam units are innocent, some of them may have the potential of becoming radicalized. So I think we are looking at multiple problems that emanate from the security situation in Myanmar. But apart from that, let me end this question on a positive note. India has played a very positive role in Myanmar. India has kept its lines of engagement open. India does not internally interfere in Myanmar's decisions, yet it extends help on humanitarian grounds. Operation Brahmos summer post the big earthquake in Myanmar last year, is a great example of how India has been a first responder, and that has gained India a lot of goodwill. I think, if I was to assess India's engagement, India believes that Myanmar can be a peaceful country, and they themselves have the ability to find out answers and solutions for their own problems. External countries need not internally interfere, except to the limit of assisting them with humanitarian aid and all assistance on humanitarian grounds.
So, while talking about India's engagement, we often stress on democratic values, and yet we say maybe continue to engage with Myanmar's military leadership. So, how do you think New Delhi reconciles what seems like a contradiction there? And do you see India maybe having a red line in this relationship, maybe a point at which it would be forced to rethink its engagement?
I think that's a very the question itself is very dependent on many other factors. At this point, there is no red flag in terms of India's engagement. India has continuously asked for democratic processes which are robust and has looked forward towards elections. And I think we have to also understand that these are India's geographies. They cannot be changed. They are our neighbors. If there is criticism, and this is a personal view, of Myanmar's democratic process not being inclusive because NLD was exempt from it, then the same standard should be applied to Bangladesh because Awami League was exempt from the elections. And unlike NLD, Awami League was actually barred from taking part in elections. So what makes the Bangladesh elections more inclusive than the Myanmar elections? Of course, I think India will continue to ask for peace and stability in Myanmar. It's also important for Myanmar to, create a more robust federal structure. And I think India would be a great example to take from, because we have a federal structure that has really worked for all the diversity in India. And we are a great example of how federalism really functions in some of the most difficult situations and how it functions successfully, whether it's in the Northeast, whether it's the autonomous districts that we have given. So I think Myanmar can be inspired from the Indian federal system, and it would work really well for Myanmar's diversity as well. But India or any other country is in no position to pass moral judgments on anybody. India's never done that. India does not interfere with internal functionings of any country whatsoever, as we don't like anybody else passing outside moral judgments on us. So I don't think India engages like that to begin with. India will probably, and again, like I said, I'm not a spokesperson, I'm not a government official, so this is all speculation on my end. India has played a real tightrope in Myanmar, and it's kept its channels of communication open with all stakeholders. And I think that's the way India will continue over a period of time. What is going to be exciting this year is to see, at least for observers like me, how EOs themselves, the ethnic armed organizations themselves, negotiate and communicate with the now elected government, whoever they may be. Will there be more channels of communication? Will there be some negotiations which will bring them to some amount of understanding? Will more federal structure be given to ethnic armed organization controlled areas? Will ethnic armed organization controlled areas themselves, within their federal powers that are given to them, have federalism within their own systems? You see, at this point, it cannot be ethnic groups for ethnic areas. Will there be diversity within their own areas? So these are all questions that we can only answer once the movement begins, and the movement will only begin after the government formation in first week April.
Understood. So, with so many variables with how things stand today, do you think Myanmar is a real test case of India's ambition to act as a net security provider in our neighborhood?
Look, I don't think Myanmar is just a test case. I think there are many cases. What's going to happen with Bangladesh also is how we are going to evolve our relationships is also going to be very important for us to see in the next 1 year. And it's not just about Myanmar and Bangladesh. Nepal will also go into elections. How situations develop there and evolve there is also going to be very important for us to see. However, I think India's ability to be able to engage and to create networks with all stakeholders has always held India in good stead. These are tough choices to make, but India's neighborhood, the geography can never change, and therefore one cannot make choices of one over the other. Only thing India needs to do is keep its channels of communication open and, if possible, be able to mediate peace wherever India is asked to do so. The other thing that India can do, especially in its neighborhood, is, like I said, ensure that the goodwill of people on ground remain. In the case of Myanmar, we see China making big inroads in Myanmar. But what still holds India in good stead is the goodwill on ground. People of Myanmar see the Chinese as transactional. They don't see the Indians as transactional. I think India, being a net security provider, is incumbent on a lot of other factors. But yes, this is going to be a difficult area. We are going to see more and more foreign interests in our northeastern borders, in our neighborhood, whether it's critical earth minerals, whether it's the port building that we've seen, whether it's new governments coming in. These are going to throw new challenges to India, and India, as a challenge comes up, will have to tailor make its responses. I don't think any response can be premeditated. I think we will have to just wait and watch how things are evolving.
So, people of Myanmar might be wary of China and its influence, but how strong is, say, China's influence in Myanmar today, looking at their politics or economics and their military engagements?
Like I mentioned in my previous response, that China, there's a big footprint of China in Myanmar. There's no doubt about that. Not only do they have long-term projects like the Chop Phu port or, the gas and oil pipeline, but they also have an influence on the ethnic armed organizations. They have influence on the MNDA, TNLA. The United Wa State has always been under their influence. They have also mediated some of the bigger ceasefires between the Tatmadaw and the EOs. Chinese products have flooded the market, and while the common man may not like the Chinese as much as they like the Indians, the fact is, if you have cheaper products on ground, you will tend to buy them. Also, we must remember that 40% of the debt in Myanmar is owed to China. So China does influence Myanmar in multiple ways, whether it's buying the critical earth minerals, whether it's the influence on the EOs, whether it is becoming mediators, or whether it is the projects that they have ongoing in Myanmar. So China is a big factor, and I think that's another aspect that India needs to closely keep an eye on and build its own counter narratives in that response.
And so, coming back to the elections, were there any surprises from this election, maybe say other than the voter turnout, or was it widely as how observers and experts predicted it would go?
No, I think we all predicted. I've been writing about this for, many years now, and way before the elections were also announced. It was pretty much natural to assess that USDP would come into power, and I don't think there were any surprises. I think it was pretty much what observers had expected. Maybe if one was to really stretch one's imagination, one would have expected more, one was expecting more offensive from EOs, and the offensive were not as brutal as some analysts had expected. So even the offensive to the elections was not as big.
And how important do you think is Myanmar to India's Act East policy today, especially when you compare it to where things stood a decade ago? Has India maybe, scaled back its expectations when it comes to Myanmar? And are the big connectivity projects we've heard about still realistic and viable in the current situation, or should we wait and see what happens?
Look, the Asian Trilateral Highway will obviously be stalled, because it goes through some of the areas that are still under certain amount of, conflict. The Kaladan multimodal project, the ambition is to complete it by 2027, and I think that's a realistic ambition. And I think, being positive, I think India will be able to complete that, and that will be an important project not just for India but also for people of Myanmar. So I think with that project, it is, one is more hopeful than one is with the Asian Trilateral Highway. However, India's ambitions of the land routes over Myanmar and, just the Act East policy of, connecting, while they may have slowed down, but there are always the sea route. So India can always, have a more sea route robust channel for trade and connectivity. But I also think that Myanmar has a positive future if Myanmar plays its cards well in terms of not allowing too much of foreign transactional influence on its soil. For example, in terms of other countries being very interested in critical earth minerals or things like that, I think that would not benefit Myanmar. So I think if they play their cards well and manage to at least bring some of the EOs that are very important EOs across India's borders on there, at least, begin some negotiations or come to some understanding, I think Myanmar could stabilize itself. But again, it's a wait and watch situation depending on, what the government formation is, who are a part of the government formation. That will tell us a lot because we will know what their antecedents are, what their predisposition is. I think the government formation will tell us a lot. But I think India, if I was to advise, India, I would say they should keep their hopes up and the engagement alive.
Understood. And not to play the devil's advocate here, would say Myanmar remains unstable for the coming years, say maybe a decade or so. So, what realistic costs would India have to bear economically and strategically? And will, say, this instability hurt India's larger goal of deeper integration with Southeast Asia?
Look, I think our primary concern would be for our neighborhood to be stable, politically stable, economically stable, and to have the least amount of international interference as possible, because the implications would be directly on India's northeastern borders. Myanmar shares 1,643 kilometers with India, and that's with India's northeastern porous borders. India's northeast is as much as we have been able to bring peace in India's northeast, it still, some of the fissures can be manipulated. It still remains more fragile, and that fragility can be manipulated. And I think it's very important for the spillover for any spillover to be countered that comes in from Myanmar, because like I said, the narcotics, the weapons, the transnational ethnic ties all can come together to, destabilize the northeastern region. This is also not just Myanmar, but also with Bangladesh. While we hope for good relations with Bangladesh, the borders still are a matter of concern. And again, that also meets, our northeastern borders. So I think the northeast is of great concern to us. I think prolonged conflict will have serious implications on India's northeast. I think the narcotics trade and the weapons trade will have serious impacts on India's northeast, and that is what we need to be very wary of. But also we must have great faith on the people of the northeastern region. I think, awareness programs and, bringing local communities on board to be able to counter the narcotics problem or the problem of, the spillover of the conflict is very, very important. A lot of times people are misled. A lot of times people don't realize the long-term implications. So I think it's very important to activate the loyal communities that we have had on our borders to be civilian eyes and ears, because without them being on board, these are not borders that you can physically plug. These are difficult terrains, these are porous borders, and these are borders that they know better than anybody else. So, there's always a loophole for as much fencing or, as much patrolling that you can do. So therefore, I really feel it's hugely important to focus on development on India's borders, to have multicultural communities on India's borders, but also to take communities on India's borders to make them aware of the consequences and take them on board as really communities that can make a difference to the northeastern security and stability.
And what about our Southeast ambitions? Because ASEAN has been leading the diplomatic response on Myanmar, but the results have been mixed so far. So, how should India engage with ASEAN in this situation? And is the idea of ASEAN centrality a bit overstated when it comes to Myanmar? How do we think about
Look,
all of
I don't think ASEAN is a grouping by itself. I don't think India needs to engage with ASEAN in terms of Myanmar. ASEAN also is fragmented in terms of not everybody is on board the election, but not everybody is against the elections. There are countries like Thailand that have tacitly sort of been okay with the elections. There are the Cambodians, there are, other countries in the neighborhood that have also extended their support, come as international observers. Nepal was there as an international observer. So I think ASEAN will continue to do what it deems right, will continue to press for more inclusive elections, but that does not mean that that's going to happen realistically. So I think, as we have seen in the past so many years, that irrespective of what has happened, elections have happened in, how do I say this, in whatever manner was possible in Myanmar in the situations, and the responses have not been unified either to support it or to boycott it. So I think ASEAN will continue to engage in the minimal way as it does, but there will be countries who will engage more. India will engage by itself. So India has a different set of responsibilities.
Understood. And Myanmar has long struggled to build a stable relationship between the civilian leadership and the military. So, are there any broader lessons for the rest of South and Southeast Asia? And can militaries that have once, become deeply embedded in politics ever be fully transitioned out of power, or does their influence simply take new forms? So, how
Look,
do
I don't
we see?
think I don't think you can compare the Myanmar situation with other situations simply because Myanmar is a very different country. It has had different historical experiences. The Tatmadaw in Myanmar has always been a part of society. It is very ingrained in the society. There's no separation between society and the Tatmadaw. Not just does it have a say in its political functioning, but also in its societal functioning. And therefore, it is very difficult to segregate the two in the way that you could segregate it anywhere else. Maybe Indonesia, yes, but again, the historical experiences are very, very different. Democratic forces like NLD and, other forces like NUG and all would want to see a complete separation of the armed forces from politics. However, what makes it difficult is exactly the point that they are very well ingrained in society. So apart from having 25% parliamentary seats reserved for them, even the societal hierarchy has the armed forces on people who are associated to the armed forces or children of the armed forces at a higher level than the rest of the civilians. So these are hierarchical issues that take many, many years to resolve if they ever get resolved. So I think the case of Myanmar is incomparable to any other case. I think at the most, what we should be expecting, and I reiterate this, is a more federal structure. Myanmar has a lot of diversity, it has a lot of ethnic groups, it has a lot of inter-ethnic rivalry as well as there's rivalry amongst, for example, Chin groups. You'd call them the Chin groups, you'd think that they are one group, but there are many, 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 almost 30 fragmented groups within them. So there is inter-ethnic sort of rivalry as well. Then there's rivalry with the Bamars, their rivalry with each other. The only way that Myanmar can really come to some amount of stability is with more space and more space for diversity and a more federal structure for everybody involved. And I think those are the lessons really that Myanmar can learn from India. As for military involvement, like I said before, though Myanmar's case is not comparable to anybody else's, but if you look at even Thailand, there is a certain amount of military presence in all spheres of life, that just seems to be the case in the neighborhood, if I may say so. But Myanmar is a unique case. Myanmar will have to find its own solutions, and one can only hope for more inclusive, more democratic process to come in coming years. But again, like I said, the government formation is going to be very critical. And after the government formation, their engagement with ethnic armed organizations and their adoption of federal structures is going to be something worth watching.
Absolutely. I think that's something all of us can hope for. But looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what is the most realistic scenario India should prepare for in Myanmar? Is there going to be gradual stabilization, a kind of managed instability?
Look,
Which of these
again, it's
paths?
something that we will have to wait and watch. These are very difficult questions to answer because the government formation as yet has not happened. Prediction would be just just shooting an arrow in the air with no details as to how the government will be formed, who will be a part of the government. I think for questions like this, the next 6 months are going to be critical. If one was to be take a more cautious study of this, one would say the conflict would ensue. It would ensue in different measures. There isn't one political roadmap for all of the ethnic armed organizations. Therefore, each ethnic armed organization has very unique needs or expectations. NUG was supposed to be an umbrella entity, but again, NUG did not represent a common political roadmap for any of the ethnic armed organizations. So if I was to take a very cautious view, I would say that different EOs, depending on the different engagements that they have and the different settlements that they have, will have conflict that will continue. Conflict has been something, it hasn't just happened since the coup. The conflicts or the ethnic armed organizations have existed way before the coup. So I don't think that is going to resolve anytime soon. But the measure of them are going to be different depending on what negotiations happen, what engagements happen. So, for example, Chin groups could fragment further, or Chin groups could, come together under a bigger umbrella identity, or with negotiations with the now newly elected government, they could come on board some level of understanding. I'm just again throwing this out in the air. Same with Arakan Army, which has not been a part of the NUG and has used different words like confederation, unitary, and federalism. Arakan Army, depending on engagement with the Tatmadaw, if it has an engagement at all, we don't know if it will, could continue its offensive, could adopt a more federal system, could continue being the way it is. We'll have to wait and watch. But I don't think the conflict is going to go away in its entirety across board. That's not going to happen. I don't think the narcotics trade business is going to wrap up. I don't think that foreign interference is, somehow going to be countered. I think they will come in. And all of that for India, like I said before, is going to create a very complex problem. And therefore, we need to be really vigilant. We need to keep our channels of communication open. These are not choices that India can make. India has to have inroads with all the stakeholders, has to get more involved in mediation, has to get more involved in industry in Myanmar in terms of having a footprint that any other country may try to have. India has to be very careful of what happens on its borders, the developments, and like I said before, keep the northeastern borders secure, needs to take local populations on board. And I think that is going to be the next 5 or 10 years in Myanmar. Expect no immediate resolutions. This is a reconciliation. This is not a resolution.
Understood. So it looks like India is in for a very long game. Do you think our approach to dealing with this right now is sufficient, just waiting, watching, and continuing to deal with Myanmar how we have been so far? Or would you recommend any few immediate tweaks to our policy towards the country?
Like I said in my previous answer, that we need to mediate more. We need to increase our trade with Myanmar. We need to engage with all stakeholders. We already doubled our pulses trade last year, and we need to continue doing that because any trade that we engage with in Myanmar will eventually have a trickling effect on local people. We need to create more skill programs. We need to invite youth from Myanmar for skilling programs in India, for military to military engagements. I think those need to be far more robust, because I think security is going to play a very big role in our neighborhood in the coming years. We need to be able to, ever so, whenever needed, be able to provide humanitarian aid just the way we provided with Operation Brahma. I think it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. But yes, should engagement be increased? Always. Should trade be increased? Always, because that is what will give you your stakeholding on ground. Should we engage with the youth? Most definitely. And that can be done at a government to government level. This is a time when the youth of Myanmar across board require help, require some amount of support in terms of, like I said before, in terms of skilling or in terms of education, in terms of higher education. This is where India can step in, and I think that will take India very far. But yes, creating channels of communication on every level, not just government to government level, but even, even other levels like think tank to think tanks, scholars to scholars, farmers to farmers, is going to be very helpful for India in the next 10 years.
Absolutely. Understood. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. And we hope to reconnect with you once developments in Myanmar start. And in the 6 months, we hope to speak to you again.
Absolutely.
But it's been incredibly insightful. And I feel like I'm walking away with a much clearer understanding of the political landscape now. So thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. Thank you.
Anytime, Aksha. Thank you for having me. And like I said, this is a very evolving situation and we are at the crux of changes happening. So I think the next 6 months to the next 1 year is going to be very, very exciting times in our neighborhood. And that will give us even a clearer picture of what our engagement should be with Myanmar. So fingers crossed, and I hope to speak to you again.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's episode with Rami Desai. The CNSS podcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies. The Center for National Security Studies was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non-traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established by an MOU between MS Ramaiah University of Applied Sciences and Army Training Command. You can find out more about our work at www.cnss.org.in.